My name's Max Hacker. I'm a naturopath, event manager, president of the Carbon Twist campaign, and drug and alcohol nurse. So, thank you. To begin with, I'd like to thank the special guests and the panel members for coming here tonight to share their wisdom, their knowledge, their values on the important issue of drug and alcohol reform. These problems are complex and multifaceted, but I hope that by the end of tonight, we'll have a clearer understanding of the advantages and disadvantages of decriminalising illicit drugs, and as well on issues that are important to you. So everyone in the audience can ask questions. So Tom and Jerry will be able to roam around and hand out microphones to everyone. So the theme of this debate is obviously new ideas to tackle drug and alcohol problems. And I encourage everyone to come here with an open mind, because in the process of exploring new solutions, it's essential to address the underlying causes of why people take illicit drugs or abuse illicit drugs. Indeed, sometimes nutrient deficiencies can cause mental health symptoms such as anxiety and depression. And it's these very symptoms that can actually drive a person to self-medicate with illicit drugs, such as cannabis, ice, even heroin, and of course alcohol. And when it comes to alcohol, there's one thing that I want to say. And the intention is to represent everyone to the fundamental truth about alcohol, which is often actually forgotten. The fact is that alcohol is an inherently toxic substance. It is by nature toxic to every cell in the human body. As we know, 100% pure alcohol sterilizes medical equipment, disinfects surfaces. It kills cells. Of course, drinking a little bit isn't going to kill you. But alcohol contributes more to social, economic, and health harms than any other drug, by far. And as Professor David Nutt has said, if alcohol was discovered today, it would be illegal. Unfortunately, Professor Nutt, who was supposed to link into this event via video from the UK, is now unable to make it. And he sends his apologies, and I'm sorry that he can't come via video. So this debate is being recorded, and everybody's welcome to ask questions. If you do get the microphone, please put the microphone close to your mouth. And also everyone can follow on the hashtag drug reform via Twitter, and you can comment right from here about things that might be discussed that might interest you. Thank you very much. Okay, so now we're going to get into the panel debate and contribution from the special guests sitting here in the front row. So I'd like to thank everyone for coming, and I'm going to start closest to me is Tom Tilley from Triple J's Hack program as guest moderator of tonight's debate. Next to him is Dr Alex Wodak, Emeritus Consultant and President of the Australian Drug Law Reform Association. Next is Jane Sanders, Principal Solicitor of the Shopfront Youth Legal Centre. Jane Bacik, CEO of Life Education New South Wales. Reverend the Honourable Fred Nile, Member of the Legislative Council, and former Superintendent Frank Hansen from the police force. Professor John Saunders has called me and he's unable to make it tonight and sends his apologies. In the front row here we have our special guests, and thank them very much for coming and contributing to this debate. We have Dr Mark Hardy, addiction specialist from Royal North Shore Hospital. Dr Robert Graham, also an addiction specialist from all over Sydney. We have Vince Coyte, CEO of the Glen Alcohol and Drug Rehabilitation Centres with a specialisation in Aboriginal health, and I look forward to hearing his views on the issue of drug and alcohol. And Gary Christian, Secretary and Research Specialist from Drug Free Australia. So now I'm going to throw it over to Tom Tilley. I'm going to give a 10-minute warning at the end with the bell. And again, anyone who wants to ask a question from the audience, put your hand up, wave it around, and Tom will seek to bring you a microphone. And again, if you want to tweet, hashtag drug reform. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you, Max. Good evening, everyone. Great to be with you. And as you heard, we've got a great range of different perspectives here on the panel, also with some of our special guests in the front row, and I'm sure amongst all of you guys as well. And as Max said, we're here to talk about new ideas in tackling drug and alcohol problems. But before we talk about new ideas, I thought it'd be great to hear from everyone on the panel, just very briefly, what do you think is the one biggest problem that we face when it comes to tackling drug and alcohol? So I'll come along the panel starting with you, Frank Hansen, the former superintendent. What do you think is the one biggest problem we face in terms of drug and alcohol use and abuse?
Well, looking at it very much from a policing perspective, because I don't pretend that I'm going to get into the issues of health, but importantly from a police perspective, the people who are involved in the use of drugs, whatever those drugs might be, in using those drugs, that we should have as police policies and practices which allows those people ready access to health services. We should be ensuring that we are contributing to that access. And I think that there are some examples of that in New South Wales with the needle syringe program, and a very strong policy that says that police will not interfere with people getting access to that. More recently, the government has been involved with the medically supervised injecting centre in King's Cross. Again, we need to ensure that police actions didn't prevent or inhibit people from getting access to health services. That's a very critical aspect. Now, laws differ all over the place, and laws change. Laws have changed considerably over the years, whether it be drugs or other things. Laws where there's probably like a no third party. Laws, we could think of laws associated with homosexuality. A few years ago, or certainly when I joined the police force, that in itself was quite a serious offence. In fact, I'm just trying to think of the wording of the section in relation to that. Yes, that's what it was. The abominable offence of buggery was the way the charge was worded. So things have changed significantly there. They've changed significantly in relation to drugs, cannabis cautioning, access to needle syringe programs. So I think that from a policing point of view, without commenting on the ins and outs of individual pieces of legislation, the important thing from a street level policing point of view, and that's where the police interact directly with those who use drugs, that they get access to the health services that they're wanting to get access to.
All right, we'll hear some of your experiences and thoughts a bit more later, Frank. Let's move to the Reverend Honourable Fred Nile. Fred Nile, if you can just very quickly state, what do you think is the one biggest problem in the way that drugs and alcohol are used, abused, or treated and policed?
I've always been a strong campaigner against both legal and illegal drugs. I'm one of the few politicians that's actually consistent. Some are against the legal ones and some are against the illegal ones, but few are against both. And I just am pleased that I've been able to see how the law can be effective in reducing the harm of various addictive products such as tobacco. I was able to introduce bills to prohibit tobacco advertising, smoking in public places, smoking in cars for children, and now the display of cigarette products in supermarkets. They now have screens over the cigarette packets, and so on. And that's brought about a dramatic reduction in smoking to, I think, about 13% now, and going down all the time, except for some categories of young women and so on. But I've also been concerned about the effects of illegal drugs, all the various types, and I have bills also dealing with alcohol. which may surprise you, to lift the age of drinking back to 21. You may, being young, not know that used to be the legal drinking age in New South Wales. I think it was up to 1967, I think it was 21. And we know the harmfulness of alcohol on the developing brain up to about 24 years of age. So that would be a useful step forward. Again, prohibiting alcohol advertising, warnings on alcohol products. I have bills that deal with that. But my main concern is that I don't think we're ever serious about the whole issue of illegal and legal drugs. And I liked the program in Sweden, which I personally went over to investigate and study, and to see how a nation works that adopts a national program of a drug-free society. And they had to re-educate every section of their society to support it. Everybody wanted it. All political parties, from Greens through to Conservative parties, supported a drug-free Sweden policy. And then they said, how do we do it? So they had to re-educate nurses, doctors, teachers, police officers, everybody, that they would get on board with that policy. And that's what I think is missing in Australia. We have to have a united approach to illegal and legal drugs, and it's been one of my challenges to try to bring that about.
Thanks, Fred. And we'll talk a lot more about the example of Sweden there, and also the example of Portugal, which is a massive contrast. Coming down the line to Jay Bacik from Life Education New South Wales. Jay, what's the one biggest problem you see in terms of drug and alcohol use, abuse, and/or treatment and policing?
I think, I guess if I knew the cause factors, that only the one speaker in the room, and you'd all be sort of panting to hear what I had to say, because I think there are many people here more eminently qualified than I am in that area. One of the issues that I do know about is the impact, and my particular focus, if not expertise, is on the protection of children and families. Now, I suppose the best qualification I have to be here tonight is that both my Czechoslovakian father and my Irish immigrant mother, who eventually got married, or I was 7 months premature, but one of those two exactly, both struggled with alcohol addiction for their whole lives. And in fact, they both died of alcohol-related illnesses in different countries. And for me, I always had an awareness, particularly growing up with the Irish side of my family, that drinking was very much a part of our culture. I don't think we ever had a party where there wasn't a fight. And so there was no such thing for me. I'm not whinging about my childhood, it did okay. But the idea of a happy drunk, I didn't meet till 20 or 30 years later when I was outside my family. So I didn't start drinking alcohol till I was 34 years of age. And even then, sort of, can I say this, Matousse Rosé is still my favourite drink. Having said that, in the course of my life, in local ministry and in media and in listening to people on Talkback Radio on TCH, I found the immense pain and struggle of people on the receiving end of the impact of alcohol abuse and drug abuse was enormous. And so when I was sort of conned into coming to Life Education, which is about talking to little children about the simple things of life, about nutrition, about choices, about relationships, about standing up for your mates, about standing up for yourself, about having a knowledge, but not so much an intellectual knowledge as a experiential knowledge of what is good and what isn't good. I'm not here speaking for Life Ed tonight, I'm here speaking for me, but our approach, I can say, is that cigarettes and is an absolute no-no, because there are no safe levels of smoking. I'm preaching to the converted here, I suspect. Alcohol, we probably don't push the danger button as hard as I've heard it pushed tonight. We actually do deal with the sugar issue quite significantly, but I'm wondering whether we should be encouraging kids to have fruit on that basis. And on the drugs issue, illicit drugs are illegal, and alcohol if you're going to drink, wait till you're old enough and drink for taste, not just for effect. Now, the issue that I've observed is that not everybody can sustain control of that. And I'm sure there are guys, you know, in the front row here whose knowledge and working with people on addiction is how they pour their hearts out every day, trying to support and sustain people. So my encouragement is to work in a preventative way to empower children, young people, and then their families come towards us. You know, people ring me up and say, that bloody giraffe of yours, Healthy Harold, came home and told me I was going to die if I continued smoking. And I used to get very technical and scientific, and I'd look up things and then and still get abused. And finally, I used to say to parents, what would you like us to teach your children about cigarette smoking? And that changed their attitude. There is a receptivity in our community of people who want their children to grow up strong and healthy and have a capacity to make choices that will make them positive contributors to our community. And I think we've got to get into families and young people and schools and give people the confidence to be able to know that, say that, and do that.
Thanks, Jay. Let's move on to Jane Sanders, who works with young people who run into trouble with the law. And Jane's someone we have on the HACK program quite a lot in relation to lots of issues, including drug policing. So, Jane, what's the most important issue from your point of view relating to drug policy?
I don't know if this is the most important issue, but this is an issue that I see time and again working with young people. And that is, I think, our society delivers messages to our young people that simply don't ring true. We have all heard, of course, and there's a lot of debate about the hypocrisy of alcohol being legal and part of our culture, as is tobacco, whereas other drugs, of course, are not. And we do see, of course, young people being preached to as if drug use is a moral issue rather than a health issue or a matter of choices. And of course, that we are now in many ways adopting a much more sophisticated approach, but that approach still persists, unfortunately. And for young people, I'm sorry, their bullshit detectors will just instantly go up, and that's not going to be an effective message. I see all the time in courts all around the Sydney metropolitan area, no doubt in regional New South Wales and all over Australia, magistrates giving the same sort of lecture to young people. Often it's young people who are caught by a sniffer dog at the big day out with one pill or whatever. And these magistrates are doing their best to try to enforce and uphold a law that many of them don't believe in. And they will deliver their message in various ways. Some of them will say, well, there's a reason why these drugs are illegal, but is it a good reason? Is it really a coherent reason which has got anything to do with anything other than history or politics? Well, you shouldn't use these drugs. The reason why they're illegal is because they're dangerous. You never know what you're getting. Well, I think the reason that you never know what you're getting is, in fact, because they're illegal and not regulated. So there are these messages that are being sent from all levels to young people which don't ring true and which get in the way of a real open discussion about various illegal and legal drugs and the choices that people might make when using them. Also, I think it's really important to recognise that for a lot of people, not just young people, but I think predominantly young people who, of course, are still developing in so many ways, cognitively, emotionally, physically, of course, that using drugs or not using drugs is not simply a matter of rational choice. And we need to really understand that in order to make any sort of input.
Thanks, Jane. And lastly, we have Alex Wodak sitting right next to me, who is one of the most well-known voices in the drug reform debate. Alex, if you could, pin it down to one main problem, what do you think it is?
Well, thank you. Before I do that, can I, on behalf of the panel, thank Max for putting on this program tonight. I think hell of a lot of hard work, very important subject, very important that we get out in the community and have these discussions. So hats off to you, Max. And hats off also to the audience for coming along tonight, and let's hope we'll hear more from the audience. What I'm going to be focusing on tonight is a comment by one of Nixon's economics advisors, Herb Stein, who used to say, things that can't go on forever don't. And that's, if that's true of any area in public policy, it's true of this area. What's the number one drug problem in Australia? Well, the answer is pretty obvious, and it's alcohol. In terms of health, social, economic cost, true, there are more deaths from tobacco, true, the economic cost of tobacco is even greater than alcohol. But when you add the social misery that alcohol causes, I think it's clear that alcohol is the number one problem. And what's the number one problem in dealing with alcohol? Do we know what needs to be done? Yes, we do. We know that raising the price, we know that reducing the availability of alcohol is a very reliable, very effective way of reducing alcohol-related problems. Is it a panacea? No. It's just very effective. We don't need huge increases to get a worthwhile benefit, or huge decreases in availability to get a worthwhile benefit, but small reductions bring worthwhile benefits. If it's so clear, why aren't we doing it? Well, the answer to that is pretty clear too, and the answer is the overwhelming power of the drinks industry in Australia and in other countries. Before the last elections, we had the Honourable Member for Blacktown, Paul Gibson, to thank for helping the Australian Hotels Association when they were ever in difficulty. And now in this Parliament we have Mr Paul Nicolau and Mr Michael Photius, not within the Parliament but looking after the interests of the Australian Hotels Association. And they're a formidable organisation. And there are other organisations we have to worry about, but that's a big one, and nobody's really got an answer to it. But before we get too depressed about it, let's remember that 30, 40, 50 years ago, audiences like this in Australia were saying the same sorts of things about the tobacco industry. And now the tobacco industry isn't it's still there, but it's a fraction of the problem that it was 30 or 40 years ago. I'd like to say something about illicit drugs, if I may, and that clearly is a major problem. There's good news and there's bad news, and I think the good news is that it's very clear over the last year or two in Australia and other countries that the intellectual case for global drug prohibition has collapsed. And now we're seeing the beginnings of the political phase of some new order that will be created, starting with the votes in Colorado and Washington states, the United States, on November the 6th last year, where 55% of voters supported taxing and regulating cannabis. That ballot initiative got more votes than the presidential candidate known as Barack Obama. So that's a pretty significant event. And we're seeing movements for cannabis regulation now in Uruguay. We're seeing New Zealand just in the last couple of weeks with a bipartisan approach to start regulating the illicit drug market, and there are many other changes going on. Important meeting in April last year of the Summit of the Americas, and over 30 countries got together in Colombia and started to talk about how to deal with this problem, moving on from prohibition. That discussion hasn't finished. So we're seeing a lot of things starting to happen. Big event this week, of course, has been the announcement by the Prime Minister of a $12 billion structural deficit in our federal budget, likely to be there for some years to come. Governments are going to be scrambling to find new ways of raising revenue and new ways of cutting costs. And they'll be looking at lazy expenditure that doesn't help Australians, doesn't help Australian taxpayers. They'll be looking at cannabis taxation as a way of providing some revenue, and they'll be and saving costs, and they'll also be looking at the huge, massive expenditure on drug law enforcement. Australia spent in 2002-3 $2.4 billion on drug law enforcement. That's things like customs, police, courts and prisons. And we got a miserable return. We taxpayers got a miserable return for that investment. 92% of drug users in Australia say that hydroponic cannabis is easy or very easy to obtain. 87% of Australian drug users say that heroin is easy or very easy to obtain. And prohibition hasn't protected young Australians. The number of, the rate of heroin overdose deaths in Australia increased 55-fold between 1964 and 1997. 55-fold between 1964 and 1997. So prohibition hasn't protected our young people, hasn't made drugs hard to get. In fact, heroin and cocaine prices have fallen about 80% in Europe and North America in the last quarter century. So it hasn't even stopped the market from producing and attracting new customers. So I think this Treasurer and future Treasurers are going to start looking at liberating some expenditure that's not doing much good. On the other hand, the methadone program saves between $4 and $7 for every dollar that's invested. And the needle syringe program saves $4 in healthcare costs for every dollar and $27 overall. So I think the people that drug prohibition supporters have got to be scared about is not me, but future Treasurers, Commonwealth, State and Territory.
Thanks, Alex. And I'll pick up on some of those comments, and I might put that to one of our special guests tonight, Gary Christian. Gary's from the Drug Free Australia organisation. He's a research specialist. And you just heard Alex say there that the intellectual case for prohibition has collapsed and that the momentum is swinging towards taxing and regulating drugs. Do you agree with those comments?
Not at all. Obama's own drug czar put out a statement saying that in the US they collect $15 billion for alcohol, from alcohol excise. But the social costs are $185 billion. All right, so if you want to regulate drugs, you're not going to get anything near as much in tax as the actual social costs. For tobacco, $25 billion is collected, $200 billion in social costs. Let's put aside such nonsense as regulating drugs is going to somehow pay for itself or is going to bring in some revenue. It's nonsense.
Is it a fact that 92% of Australian drug users say that hydroponic cannabis is easy or very easy to obtain? 87% say heroin is easy or very easy to obtain. What value are we getting from spending 10 years ago $2.4 billion a year to try and make heroin and cannabis hard to get? It's not achieving its goals.
And in reply to that, I have the figures here from the 2010 survey. It's nothing like that, Alex. When it comes to ease of getting drugs, I'll pull out the figures if you like. The figures are very low, and illicit drug use within this country is very low. We have 0.2% on heroin, we have 2% on 3% on ecstasy, 2% cocaine, 2% speed ice. Tobacco, 18%, alcohol, 81%. You know, those are big figures, and that's because they are illicit.
I'll just give my source, if I may. I'm quoting from the 2012 illicit drug reporting survey carried out by the National Drug and Alcohol Research Centre, and I'll be publishing something later this week, and the website.
Easy to obtain.
The website. Sorry, I didn't finish. The website will be identified.
5.7%.
Yeah, well, let's not get buried down in who's got the right source. But I guess the big argument that's on the table here is really about the levels of drug use for drugs that are illegal versus the level of drug use for drugs that are legal. And you're making the point there, Gary, that we've got very, very low figures. 0.2% people using heroin in the last 12 months and 3% using ecstasy as examples versus 80% for alcohol. But the potency of those drugs hugely different. You know, comparing someone who uses cigarettes compared to someone who's using heroin is pretty hard to compare, don't you think?
1 in every 300 people who are tobacco users will die from that addiction.
But over what
when it
period
comes
of
to
time?
heroin, it's 1 in every 100 from overdose alone. Put aside all the other ways that you die from heroin. That's just overdose, so it's far more toxic.
Yeah, and that's my point. So why compare the usage figures of those two drugs when the effects are so vastly different?
But, every drug is different, and really, basically, the way that the United Nations looks at these things, they say there is a threshold over which the harm of the drug is unacceptable, and the community is behind that. United Nations represents, vast numbers of communities, countries. So it's unacceptable. At this stage, they haven't made alcohol and tobacco unacceptable because they are entrenched. We do not want to entrench the illicit drugs in the way that we have alcohol and tobacco.
All right, let's go to Fred Nile.
Just a quick comment on Dr Wodak quoting that survey. I know it was quoted believing to be true. I don't believe you can use a survey of drug users on which you base your drug policies. In other words, I don't believe they're telling the truth. Because they're drug users, they would be saying, yes, I had no trouble getting my drugs.
Well, with due respect, Reverend Nile, you're not a researcher. It's perfectly valid to study what drug users report, and it should be part of the combination of information that policymakers and others take into account when deciding drug policies. They are Australian citizens, and we should be interested in their health and well-being, and doing surveys on drug users should be part of the work that we do.
All right, the example of Sweden and the example of Portugal have both come up in the debate already, and Portugal is somewhere where it has taken moved away from prohibition, and Sweden is a very tough on drugs policy. Fred,
Portugal's modifying their policies right now as we speak.
All right, well, Fred, you raised the example of Sweden before, and you talked about it being a drug-free society. It's not a drug-free society. People still use drugs, and end up in alarming sort of health conditions from that. What is it that you like about the Swedish approach?
These are the charts supplied by the United Nations showing drug use for all the nations of the world, or at least the OECD nations. The highest one up here is Australia, and the lowest one down here in the corner is Sweden. That's the facts. We should be ashamed of ourselves. Dr Wodak should be ashamed of himself.
Dr Wodak.
The policies that we have in Australia, harm minimisation, has put us at the top of the list for the OECD countries.
Are they figures you're familiar with, Dr Alex Wodak, and are you ashamed of yourself?
Well,
I'm just criticising his policies.
Well, we've got one study telling us what governments spend our money on in response to illicit drugs. This is a study by Timothy Moore from the Drug Policy Modelling Program, part of the National Drug and Alcohol Research Centre at the University of New South Wales. And Timothy Moore's study found that in the financial year 2002-03, Commonwealth, State and Territory governments spent $3.2 billion in that financial year in response to illicit drugs. 75% went to drug law enforcement, 10% went to prevention, 7% went to drug treatment, 5% went to the healthcare of drug users, 1%, $32 million went to harm reduction. So to blame harm reduction for this when we spend $32 million on harm reduction and not blame drug law enforcement where we spend $2.4 billion seems to be outlandish. Look, I think one thing needs to be said about these international comparisons, and that is, yes, Sweden looks good when you look at drug use statistics. That's true, that's perfectly true. But Sweden doesn't look so good when we look at death rates. Sweden has, according to the European Monitoring Centre on Drugs and Drug Addiction, Sweden has the 8th highest per capita rate of overdose deaths. Netherlands has the 19th, Portugal has the 25th, 8th, 19th, 25th. The rates in Sweden are going up. Now, how can we explain apparently low levels of reported drug use in Sweden with very high rates of drug-related death? And I think the answer to that is fairly clear. Because of the ferocious drug policies that Sweden has, Swedish citizens are terrified about telling the truth when they're reporting to even apparently anonymous surveys. So I think that explains why the levels of reported drug use are so low in Sweden, yet the levels of drug deaths are so high and are rising. They're falling in the Netherlands.
We've got a couple of addiction specialists here in the front row. We've got Mark Hardy and Robert Graham, and one of the questions that I'd love to hear answered from you guys is about the way drug users react to changes in the law. Are drug users more or less likely to use drugs that are illegal versus legal?
Drug users are essentially a very conservative bunch of people. I'm Mark Hardy, by the way, I'm an addiction specialist, in that they use what they use. They develop to become dependent on a drug is not so much a choice as a coning down of a menu of substances that may be exposed to an individual at an early age. And we call this a phenomenon salience, where at the end of the day, one drug, more or less, is the drug of choice. One style of use becomes the style of use preferred.
It'd be good if you were standing up and talking to the audience, not just talking to us.
Yeah. So for a lot of drug users might start out with a wide range of drugs. And let's face it, about 90% of the Australian population will try substances, be it cannabis, be it alcohol. More than 90% probably try nicotine, and other substances. A surprisingly large number of people will try some very hard drugs like stimulants and opioids. And the interesting thing is that although over 90% of people will try these drugs, only about 9 or 10% will ever have major problems with these drugs. But this is essentially buys into a medical model of how we approach the treatment of drug dependence. In that most people who are dependent on drugs have multifactorial reasons for becoming addicted to drugs. I'm getting a bit away from the subject. The question was about changes in law causing changes in substances.
Exactly.
We find that salience really reigns supreme with this. And external environmental factors imposed on drug users, like the heroin drought in the first half of the last decade, caused a subtle change in behaviour amongst opioid-dependent individuals, but didn't really change the overall flavour of opioid use in this country. And so what we saw was a rise commensurately in prescription opioid use and abuse, and numbers from the pharmaceutical benefits branch of Medicare Australia would support about a 2,500% increase in one of the main opioids that were marketed during that time and are still available in Australia today. And so it's a bit like evolution. If you change the external environment, drug users will eventually find a way to hit the same target, even in the face of virtually zero availability. If you can't import the right sort of cannabis, people will grow it. If you can't get cocaine, people will use methamphetamine.
Well, Mark, what do you make of Gary's point before when he compared the levels of drug use for illicit drugs that are illegal versus, the widespread use of cigarettes and alcohol?
I think in the context of illicit drug use is that it is a very small percentage of people who use illicit drugs. Large numbers of people, the numbers he quoted for people using alcohol and nicotine are correct. His take on the harms from nicotine being approximately 1 in 300 people die, I repudiate out of hand. The World Health Organization also used measures for determining how sick a country is or how much money is lost as a consequence of certain drugs used. And And they call this disability adjusted life years. We refer to them in public health and in addiction medicine as dailies. The dailies for alcohol and cigarettes are astronomically high compared to those for illicit drugs. Illicit drugs dailies are very, very slight. It doesn't mean that they're not dangerous. You know, illicit drugs, of course, can be dangerous. Nicotine can be dangerous. But when we look at a population and how it uses substances, the substances that are available illicitly, alcohol and nicotine, are far more harmful in terms of what it costs society, in terms of loss of income and loss of productivity and loss of life than other substances that are currently available on the black market or illegally.
All right, let's hear from Vince Coyte, who works extensively with the Aboriginal community. Vince, what effect do you think it would have on Indigenous people in particular to decriminalise drugs?
I don't think it would have any effect at all. I don't think that, I've dealt with, over my career, about over 1,000 men who exhibit alcohol and other drug addiction. And when you ask them that question, they couldn't give a stuff. It's no effect at all. You can give all the statistics you like. The politicians and the police might be interested in it. But down at the workplace, who gives a stuff? The big question is, and this is the question you should be asking, why in our society, in our culture, do people use them? And I tell you, the cause of addiction is a breakdown in culture. Culture is supposed to give everyone the rewards and the way of life, and our culture's broken down. And then, especially with our Aboriginal people, the culture's been completely destroyed in lots of cases. It's been replaced by alcohol and other things. So I tell you, what you should be asking yourself, it's not whether it's legal or not. You should ask yourself, what causes it? Why do people use? And I tell you, I've been actually having group discussions with our guys because of this meeting tonight. And we've gone through all the reasons. And nobody asked the question, why do people use these drugs? They use it because of low self-esteem. They use it to feel good. Why does a bloke walk into a pub and have 2 beers and then go home? He feels good. Nobody drinks or uses drugs to feel bad. Then some people, when they cross over, they have to stay there. And they become addicted. But the thing is, in the first case, everyone uses it to feel good. It's a self-esteem issue. One guy said, I used it to feel heavenly and end up feeling like hell. And the thing is this, in our programs, we then try and treat the causes in the personality. One bloke talked about fixing the body with all the detoxins and that. But I think it's more important to fix the mind and the emotions. That's where we need to give treatment. And the biggest cause in Aboriginals is trauma. Trauma is generational with Aboriginals. The trauma is handed down from generation to generation. And they all experience the trauma themselves in their home life. Some people, I remember one bloke said to me, I didn't realise there was such a thing as alcoholism. I almost thought that was how you behaved. You got drunk and hit each other in the head with bottles, empty bottles, you know. But the thing is, we've had to deal with in our program with a young guy from Sierra Leone. He watched all his family get murdered, as did a soldier from Greece who fought in the last Balkan Wars for the Serbians. He saw many atrocities. And now we're getting all the Australian troops coming back with trauma. And we think, oh yeah, the soldiers have got trauma, and they have. And if you don't treat the trauma, they'll turn out like a lot of Vietnam veterans, raging alcoholics, because the trauma they suffered was never treated. And they say, oh, we've got to treat this trauma. We've got to treat the trauma with the Aborigines. And we've got to treat the trauma with a lot of our young people. Our young people growing up in domestic violence. How do we move on? That's part of what we do in our specialists, counsellors and outside experts in treatment. So I don't give a stuff about your statistics. I don't care.
And you don't give a stuff about the laws changing? You really don't think that's
I
important?
don't think it'll make a difference. If you don't treat the trauma, you can have all the laws you like.
Vince, you work with people who are obviously coming to seek your help and to seek services, and obviously a lot of those people, the reason they are abusing drugs is because of the trauma they've gone through. But what do you say to other parts of society that see their alcohol or drug use as recreational?
Well, the thing is, if the drug use is recreational, in my humble opinion, and I haven't done PhDs on it or anything like that, is it harmful? You see, if someone asked me to define an alcoholic, I would say it doesn't matter how much they drink or how often they drink. It's what it does to them. And you see, if a recreational drug gives someone a pleasant night at a party or whatever, I mightn't say go ahead, but is it harmful? But what happens to those people who it has a very bad effect on?
Yeah, and that raises the question about how we treat drugs and alcohol as a society, because there are people that can use them and have a good time and not end up in an abuse situation. Then there are other people who, as you rightly say, it affects them quite differently. So what's your view on where to draw the line through the middle?
Well, it's not a drawing the line through the middle, mate. It's a drawing of the person themselves draws the line. If the person says, I have no problem, then you can't do a bloody thing for them. Now, many people here, if I said to you, especially you young blokes, if I said, now, don't you drink? What would you say to me? Bugger off, old fella. Yeah, you can't be told. And a lot of us couldn't be told where we go. But I say, the thing is, if the person has a problem, then they will seek help and should be able to get help. If a person doesn't want help, all the laws in the world won't change it.
I'll just quickly throw to Jane Sanders, because people that maybe are running into drug problems, health problems, or potentially legal problems as the laws stand at the moment, they can be reticent to seek the help that they need because of the ramifications of doing that. I mean, do you see a need for change so that people do feel free to seek help?
I agree with everything Vince says, and certainly I've worked for almost 20 years with people, young people who have had trauma handed down through generations, both Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal. And Vince is right that no matter what the law says, these people are going to be using drugs, legal or illegal, to mask or to self-medicate for unresolved trauma. It's true. For the perhaps recreational drug users out there, or the people for whom drug use is perhaps occasional, it's under control, it doesn't represent a huge health or social problem, I would say that the law that currently criminalises possession and use of even very small amounts of cannabis, cocaine, amphetamines, ecstasy, whatever, is causing harm. Firstly, of course, and as Alex has made the point, that of course it diverts huge amounts of money and resources into law enforcement, which could better be used elsewhere on health, education, all of those areas. We see, I've already said, I think I often see in court a few weeks after the big day out, there's huge numbers of young, generally law-abiding, generally pretty well-functioning people who are being hauled up before the court and criminalised for possession of 1 or 2 pills. Substances which, in the context that they use them, are, I would say, for 99% of those young people, going to do very little harm.
Yeah, Jane, I might throw this over to Frank Hansen, the former police officer. Frank, we've had a few things thrown up in the air here. We've talked about there from Vince, you know, looking at why people end up abusing drugs or alcohol, but also how those people are treated by the law and also the cost of enforcing the current laws. What are your views about and your experiences of the cost of enforcing the current policies and laws on drug and alcohol?
And of course, this is not an excuse, but of course the police don't make the laws to start with. But certainly, I think we've got to work from the position that the reality is people do use drugs and they use alcohol irresponsibly and dangerously. So I think it's important and rather than talking about law enforcement, I'd like to think we were talking about police applying the laws and allowing a little bit more flexibility for police to apply those laws. And I see cannabis cautioning scheme operating in New South Wales. It hasn't been the end of the world as we know it. It applies to a small amount of cannabis. People are given an official caution. There's a structure in place. If they're cautioned 2 or 3 times, then they may then be put before the court. See it as a pretty reasonable model to apply to other drugs. And then we can look at some of the quantities that we could apply to that. Cannabis has got a quantity applied to it, as would the others. I think that there is merit in, merit, of course, was a, and I move on now to where people are before a court, that I think the courts are in an excellent position, not necessarily to criminalise, but to provide support to people who may be starting to go down that path or have gone down that path of drug use.
Frank, when you talk about support, obviously that takes resources to deliver that support. What do you think about the question over diverting money that's spent on policing drugs and directing that more towards treating drug users and supporting them?
Sure, that's a difficult role at street level for police. But once they're before the court, I think the courts have got the opportunity then to refer people for treatment. And in doing so, there's a little bit of a lever, I suppose, that courts can apply that would not necessarily be out there in the general community. But it's an opportunity to refer people to treatment. We have that now with merit, magistrates early referral to treatment. And I think that's been a fairly successful model. To keep people out of the court, that's something that rests back with the quantities of drugs seized, and I say the cannabis cautioning scheme is a reasonable model.
Yeah, that's something we actually had Nick Bingham, who's the drug squad commander, on our program 2 weeks ago, and he made exactly the same comment, basically, that the cannabis cautioning system should be applied to traditional illicit drugs, and he got a massive rap over the knuckles from his superiors for saying that during an interview which I put to air. I'd love to get a question from the floor in just a moment. First, I'll just go to you, Reverend Fred Nile. I mean, what do you make of this balancing act that the politicians have to make on whether they spend the money on enforcing the current laws or potentially soften those laws and spend more of that money that was spent on police enforcing those laws on health and drug treatment?
I think the funding should be for both. I've never said...
But you're a politician, Fred. I mean, there's a limited amount of money. If you had to choose, do you think we've got the balance right?
I'd increase the money spent on drug rehab programs.
And would you take it away from more?
Tragedy when some drug addicts can't get treatment, can't get a bed. I'm annoyed by that. So I'm not in favour though of dropping the law enforcement program, but a lot of that money may be wasted. Depends on how it's implemented.
Is that what you feel? Do you feel like money is wasted on policing the current laws?
In some ways, I'm not criticising the police, but I think with the harm minimisation, the police are really have no hope. You can pour millions of dollars into law enforcement. We have a half-hearted approach to creating a drug-free society. I think someone made a comment when I said drug-free Sweden. I never said Sweden was drug-free. That was a policy, that a drug-free Sweden. And we don't have that policy in Australia. And that's why we're in trouble.
But if we went down the path that the way Sweden has gone...
We have harm minimisation, which teaches young people how to use illegal drugs safely.
Yeah, but you're talking about Sweden there where they've taken a tougher stance on drugs, but you just said before that if you had to choose, you'd like to see the money spent looking after people who've got into trouble with drugs.
I'd like to increase the money spent on rehab.
But my first question to you was, you've only got a limited pool of money. If you had to choose one or the other, and you said to help people who are abusing drugs, so where do you stand?
There's lots of money there. There's billions of dollars.
Oh, I don't know about that.
Just how it's allocated.
Can I just make
politicians waste a lot of the money too.
Let's hear from Jay.
Can I just make the point? I haven't been to Sweden, unfortunately, but I've read about what happens there. A lot of their policy, tough though it may be, has a very strong support for offenders. And I noticed a sort of a bit of a dip up that way for Sweden drug use when they went through some difficult times and withdrew some of the support for offenders. And I think that's a dumb thing. It's a bad thing. I mean, my other comment about the legalisation, and I'm sort of surprised that Alex would use the legalisation or sort of making drugs more freely available under supervision and under government control to raise taxes to meet the $12 billion hole that we've got at the moment. I mean, one of my concerns is the last people I want, and we talk about the crooks running the drug business, we want to hand the drug trade from the crooks to the government. And I understand today that all around schools in New South Wales, there were school buses lined up to take the kids to and from school, and there were no school children at school today. Now, that scares the daylights out of me. And also there's a naive approach that when we take this stuff from the crooks, they're going to go out of business. We make the usage age, say, 18, like we do with alcohol, and they're going to sort of put the queue on the rack and say, well, we're out of business. They will just pitch to the younger group of kids that we ought to be really concerned about.
Jay, I don't think anyone suggested that the government would be peddling the drugs if they were made legal.
No,
they're talking about regulating drug suppliers.
Big drug companies, I can imagine business plans already in place to be able to come in and fill the vacuum. But I'm saying the government, though, would have to, if they change the laws, would have to take responsibility for the outcome and the implication of those law changes, both in terms of the community and in terms of the price that we pay in social and community capital. That's my concern, practical.
Sure, we'll get to this audience question in just a second. Alex Wodak, you wanted to respond to some of those points?
If I may, briefly, two comments, quick comments. And Vince, I agreed with a lot of what you said, a lot of common sense in that. But the part I don't agree with is that whatever the law is going to make very little difference. 35 years ago, in this city, a young and very handsome and dashing Frank Hansen would have arrested anyone in this audience who was drunk in Taylor Square. And Frank Hansen would have taken you to a police lockup where you would have dried out, you would have appeared before a magistrate, you got a 28-day sentence for being drunk in public. And then you'd get released and you'd go straight out to Taylor Square and get drunk again. Now, that didn't do that individual any good at all. It cost a truckload of money. And the Land government sensibly decriminalised public drunkenness in the 1970s. It made a huge difference because those people could now get health and social support that they needed. And this is what happens. Alcohol prohibition, 1920 to 1933 in the United States, a colossal disaster. But one of the things that's not told about alcohol prohibition in the United States is that the treatment for alcoholism disappeared. Alcoholism didn't disappear, but the treatment for it disappeared. You try and getting treatment for alcoholism in any of the countries that practice total alcohol prohibition today, half a dozen Islamic countries in the Persian Gulf. So this question is very clear. If you have prohibition, you have minimal and lousy quality treatment generally. And if you have drug law reform, one of the major benefits is expanding the capacity, improving the quality, and improving the flexibility and range of different treatments provided to people who have a health and social problem. Let's give them the help they need. The only way to do that is by reforming the laws.
Thank you. All right, we have a question from the floor.
Hello, my name is Shannon. I'm a first-year medical student at Sydney Uni. This is a question related to harm reduction. I'm Canadian and have followed the story of Vancouver's medically supervised injection site pretty much from its inception. And Vancouver has seen a marked decrease in transmission of HIV, hepatitis C. There's been no fatal overdoses in the downtown Eastside area since the introduction of this program in this facility. I was just wondering, for anybody who knows, have there been the same results with the introduction of the supervised injection site here in Sydney? And for the people who are on the panel who are opposed to the harm reduction methods, what do you make of these results?
All right, Mark, is that something you can answer?
Absolutely. I think anyone who's trained in addiction would be able to answer that.
Actually, we have Marion Chauncey here, who is the director of the Injecting Centre, so let's hear from you. I didn't see that.
Hi, thanks for your question. I'm Marion Chauncey, I'm the medical director of the medically supervised injecting centre in King's Cross, and I've actually just come back from Vancouver, which was my first visit to the service there, and basically we were the first injecting centre in the English-speaking world. We opened in 2001. And Vancouver Insight opened a couple of years after us. Supervised injecting facilities, I think, are best described as a pragmatic and compassionate response to, as I think someone said, the reality, that whether you like it or not, drug use is a reality. We had a very high accidental death rate from heroin overdose in King's Cross, as they did in the downtown east side. The evidence, not only from our centre but from Insight and from around the world, is that there is absolutely no question that these facilities not only reduce death but reduce injury by providing prompt treatment so that you don't get acquired brain injury from low oxygen levels. They're well supported by their local communities, and certainly here in Australia we have widespread support from all relevant medical organisations, the AMA, the College of Physicians, the College of Psychiatrists, the College of GPs, as well as research institutions. So there's not really anyone sensible left that says these services don't work. They unfortunately do remain somewhat politically sensitive.
Can I just add something quickly before I hand over the microphone? And that is that I think it's probably incorrect to assume that because people support harm minimisation or decriminalisation of drug use, that we somehow are soft on drugs or support drug use unconditionally. That couldn't be further from the truth. I dedicate my entire career towards reducing the harms of drug use and, where possible, helping people to cease using drugs. And I think often what gets thrown up when we have debates about criminalisation versus decriminalisation of drug use is the black and white, good, bad, right, wrong scenario that we're bad because we support drug use. That couldn't be further from the truth. We support drug users in their quest to find better healthcare, better legal options, better housing and social conditions, and, if possible, less drug use. And that's basically what harm minimisation and decriminalisation is all about.
It's interesting you raised the injecting trial room, and you know it's no longer a trial anymore. It's ongoing because it works basically. And you said no one almost in their right mind would oppose it. But Fred Nile, you tried to shut it down. What's your view on injecting?
And I still would. It's part of the inconsistency in our society. We're supposed to be trying to be a drug-free society, and we actually have a centre where we have people go and inject drugs, and it's funded by the government. I mean, the whole thing to me is just inconsistent.
But on what grounds? Moral grounds or health grounds?
That's why no other state in New South Wales has one.
But is it on moral grounds or health grounds? Because you're hearing the health impacts.
Why aren't there injecting rooms in every town and suburb if it's so successful? Most sensible people know it's wrong.
But Fred, why don't you answer my question?
The Greens want to put them in every town.
All right, you don't want to. Gary, I'll go to you first, and then I'll come to you here, Robert.
All right, so there is not one evaluation of the injecting room that has found that it reduced HIV or HCV. Not one. Marion, you might tell me which evaluation you would get that from, because I've got all of them.
Can you address that point, Marion, about HIV impact?
So I think the best description of a supervised injection facility is, so when I started working in King's Cross, and I worked at a needle syringe program, a service that provided needles. What we do in those programs, and we have done since the late 1980s in Australia, is provide drug users with equipment in order to use those drugs. Now we know that they're using what they're using that equipment for. We're not kidding ourselves that they're diabetics who can't afford a syringe. We are providing drug users with equipment to use drugs. Why are we doing that? Because we're concerned about their health and the health of the broader society. And what have we been able to do in Australia? We have been able to keep the rate of HIV amongst people who use drugs to about 1%. Why? Because we give them that clean equipment in a non-judgmental approach, because we're concerned about health.
So you've kept it steady, or has that been in decline?
So NSPs work very well in Australia, but my point is what we have always had to do, and what I personally used to have to do, is provide equipment, see someone come up, try and talk to them, try and start a conversation. Hey, how are you? I haven't seen you before. What are you using? How can I help? What else can I do? What's going on for you? Where are you living? La 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 la. Give them this equipment, and they have to walk away. Now, if they started using the equipment that I've just provided, I'd have to say, oh no, sorry, I know I've just given you that equipment, but you must move away because you cannot do that. Even though I'm concerned about your health from a bloodborne virus point of view, you have to walk away and possibly die of a drug overdose down the road because I can't watch you do it and I can't provide any assistance. So what a supervised injecting facility does is basically go what I think is the very next logical step to say, I may not approve of what you're doing, but as a medical professional, as a clinician, I want to try and help. So I'll provide you with the means to not get bloodborne viruses or pass it on to somebody else, and go the next logical step so that you're not going to die of overdose. So Gary is right that there has been no specific formal evaluation of supervised injection facilities. What there has been for 25 years is formal evaluation of the NSP service, which is what supervised injection facilities do. They provide clean injecting equipment to drug users. And so clearly the wealth of evidence internationally shows without doubt that needle syringe services are effective.
Yes. That's not true, Marion. That is not true. The Institute of Medicine, let's talk the evidence. The Institute of Medicine did a 2006 review, 24 scientists, researchers, reviewers. This is the biggest study in the world. It found that the science for NSP, needle syringe programs, was inconclusive when it comes to HIV. There is no evidence that it is effective with HCV. Alex went to the trouble of telling us the savings. Those savings are absolutely false, where there is no evidence for their effectiveness. If they're not scientifically, when you do the science, if they're not shown to be conclusively effective, then there is no saving. The other thing, Marianne, is that you would have us believe that a person coming into King's Cross to get a clean needle 50 metres down the road at the old fire station, the needle exchange there, is as soon as they get that needle, they're going to go out and find a dirty needle and inject it. No, they don't do that. No, but that's what you're having us believe. You're saying somehow that the injecting room is superior to the needle exchange down the road. The injecting room has no effect on HIV or HCV, but the needle exchange has. And the needle exchange has, according to the science, let me finish, lady. According to the science, it is not conclusively effective for HIV and no effectiveness for HCV.
All right, let's go to Robert Graham.
That's the science.
Thanks for your thoughts there, Gary. Robert Graham, you're an addiction specialist. What do you make of this argument?
Hi, thanks for inviting me tonight. Look, I've been working for Coyte in this area for 12 years, and I can tell you, sure, that none of my patients has ever said that they would be discouraged from using illicit drugs because of their legal status. It doesn't happen. You ask someone, would you not smoke cannabis because it's legal, like as if you're from Mars? It's just not an issue. Look, it's a very complex debate. It's a whole.
There's a lot of young people.
No, well, it might stop some initiation, but certainly not stop people continuing to smoke. And it's not true that illicit drug use is rare in society. Use of ecstasy in young people and cannabis is very common. So common that almost a large minority of Australians, in the millions, hold the law in contempt for smoking cannabis. The number of people in Australia who have smoked cannabis at some time in the past is in the millions, not the thousands. Look, it is a complex area. We're looking at a complex area of lots of different policies, lots of different drugs, and the idea of consistency has been brought up. Let's talk about consistency. Most of us here agree that we're getting it right with tobacco policy. Tobacco smoking rates are going down, smoking-related diseases are going down because we've got the policy balance right. We don't have prohibition, we don't have unfettered trade, we've got strong regulation, we're doing the right thing. With alcohol, I also agree with Fred Nile. We're doing well. I don't agree that raising the age to 21 is the best policy, although there is some evidence that it works.
Medical evidence.
Yes, there is good evidence, but there's even better evidence that cutting down on outlet density, opening hours, taxation through a volumetric tax, all those things will work too, as well as cutting down on the rampant advertising to what is obviously to young people to try and get them to drink more, such as with alcohol pops and sponsoring sporting events. All those things have got a bit out of whack over the last 15 to 20 years, and we've seen alcohol problems escalate. I think that'll go back. But the major problem of inconsistency is in the policy of so-called illicit drug use. When you get down to the debate, you often get circular arguments. Why are illicit drugs bad? Well, in the end, we get to a circular argument, they're bad because they're illicit. What really counts is what's the effect on public health. And there's no doubt that the prohibition of drugs is one of the major factors leading to their harm. I'm going to say something rather controversial, and that is that heroin, as an example of an illicit drug, is actually a fairly safe drug when used in a controlled manner. It's almost medically identical to morphine, which is used widely in medicine. What makes it illegal is its illicit status. Prohibition increases the harm for many drugs. Now, there are some drugs that are inherently more harmful, such as cocaine and speed, but they too have their harm increased by their legal status. The whole policy of global drug prohibition is a bit like that of communism. It's a failed ideology. It can't go on. Ultimately, communism failed because it wasn't economically sustainable. The same is true of global drug prohibition. It's just not cost effective. And in this day of the global financial crisis and so forth, it's just not sustainable anymore. Alex is right. The global consensus on global drug prohibition is falling apart. Finally, we've had a number of arguments against decriminalisation of drugs that have been based on crystal balls. If we do this, this will happen. And there's no proof of that. There's no proof that if we decriminalise certain drugs that their use will increase. That certainly hasn't been seen in jurisdictions where drugs have been legalised, such as in Portugal, where there was no increase in drug use, but there was a remarkable drop in harm. So that's where we're leading towards. Whether people like it or not, global drug prohibition is falling apart. But that doesn't mean we can have an unfettered use of drugs. What we want to do is aim for a sensible medium, a sensible modicum of regulation with the aim to improve the health and welfare of people who use drugs, rather than just concentrate on the drug use itself. And one more point about why people use drugs. It is talked about quite a lot. And especially in populations such as the Aboriginal population, we do talk about why people use drugs. It's a mixture of biological, psychological and social factors that we've talked about. One thing that isn't well known is that amongst the Aboriginal population, the rate of abstinence of people who don't drink is actually higher than in the general population. And I've noticed that there are reasons to be optimistic amongst the Aboriginal population. I've worked with many Aboriginal people. There's an increased sense of pride, and I think an increased number of people who identify as Aboriginal people, and I think that's part of the answer with some of the problems that Aboriginal people have with drugs and alcohol. So, thank you.
All right, thanks so much. And, we're pretty much out of time. Fred, you have the
Portugal, in
closing
the last
words.
few months, has reintroduced convictions for drug use. Portugal, it has failed, and they have modified their policy right now, and are making some substances.
You've thrown something that's got Alex's head disagreeing. What do you think about that statement?
It's not true, and one of the things that's happened, of course, Portugal is one of the countries in the European Union that is suffering worst from the financial problems, that budgetary problems and debt. And one area that hasn't been cut has been the Commission on Drug Dissuasion, so that they keep the policies they introduced on July 1st, 2001, which are very popular, have 70-80% popular support, and really no one from the mainstream in Portugal raises the notion of scrapping the system.
All right, well, that's all we have time for. We could keep on talking, Fred, and we will, because this debate is going to continue for years to come as Australia looks at what works and what doesn't work. So I want to thank everyone for coming along tonight, you in the audience and our panel members, Frank Hansen, Fred Nile, Bacik, Jane Sanders, Alex Wodak, and our special guest down the front. And I'll throw back to you, Max.
Thank you again for everyone for coming tonight. Again, thanks to Tilley from Triple J, the HACK program. Appreciate it you coming out here tonight. And thanks as well to all the panel members, special guests, and everyone in the audience. If somebody wants to watch this again, or knows someone who couldn't come and would like to watch the video, it'll be online on the website up here, www.naturopathmax.com. And yeah, that's
Good on you.
yeah, thank you very much. And very briefly, I'd like to outline the next public forum that's coming up, which is about air pollution and its effects on human health, especially children's health, its effects on the economy and health economics, and on the sustainability of the health system. I haven't met a lot of people who like pollution, so if you'd like to be invited to this event, you can register your interest at the front there, and we can be in touch. That's going to be an interesting debate. On the invitation list for that are Al Gore and Foreign Minister Bob Carr. So, who as New South Wales Premier was the world's first government to put a price on carbon pollution. That's why he's a relevant person. That's why I'd like him there. Yeah, that wraps it up. So thanks again.